Hi, good afternoon. This is for my small group communication class. This is Professor Barry Brennan. And today we're going to talk about that little thing called listening. So often in communication courses, we focus on what we're saying, how we say it, talk, 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 talk. And we forget about that whole other part of communication, which is listening. So I'm going to walk you through a PowerPoint. And let's get to it right now. All right, listening for understanding in the small group. There's a quote by a Bryant McGill. One of the most sincere forms of respect is actually listening to what another has to say. Just let that sink in for a minute of the importance of listening. When you really listen, you don't interrupt them, you let them fully say what they need to say. That is really a sign of respect when you do that for someone. So when we talk about hearing, different than listening, you've probably heard this before. Hearing is a passive thing, right? Just the sounds going by. But listening means you're actually putting your attention toward whatever that person is saying. You are putting your attention there. Whereas it's an you're actively participating in the communication, okay? But hearing is like you're hearing it. Like you could be sitting doing something and you're hearing in the background people talking. That's just hearing, okay? You're not really putting your attention, but it's in and out. Excuse me for a minute. Oh, sorry about that. Okay. I want us to look at kind of understanding this from a science point of view and an academic point of view of how we understand listening. So from a cognitive scientist, now cognitive scientists are people that study the brain and how we think and how our brains work. So they say listening is actually a conscious mental process that includes how we select things, like what we put our attention onto, whatever that is. It's part of actually the perception process. What we put our attention onto is how we select what we're going to listen to. So there's selection, then we do this thing, we organize it, we make sense of it. That's how what's called interpretation. We're trying to make sense of what are they saying? And if you remember about interpretation, there's all kinds of pieces to it, right? It's our cultural background, it's our gender, how we grew up, our life experiences. I mean, there's so many pieces that go into how we interpret and what we focus on in that communication and what we don't focus on. And then we go through this where we integrate it, right? What's called, what we think of storage recall, is how we put that all together in our memory and what we remember about that conversation. And the conversation usually tells us, or the communication usually tells us something about that person, and it integrates into what we already know, what's previously in there, and it gets integrated with all that other information. All right, communication researchers look at listening as a step in the communication process in which we sense, right? So that's that just being aware of, we interpret, we then evaluate, that's missing in the cognitive scientists, but we evaluate, right? We figure out, is this worth listening to? Is it not worth listening to? We have some judgment about it. We discern, and then we respond. But evaluate can also mean how we're making sense of something. But we're evaluating maybe the value in terms of our tone, or is it a threat in the way they're talking to us, right? We're doing some evaluation, and that affects how we respond. And from that, we retain that experience of communication in our mind and in our bodies. So you notice how communication researchers look at something and then cognitive scientists look at it a little differently. Okay, before we're even going to get into listening, let's look at what poor listening habits are. So we're really clear on what that means, and then we're going to leave that and we're going to go into basically different ways of listening. Stephen Covey, he is known for the 7 habits of highly effective people. Excuse me again. And it's in the evening, so I apologize so much for doing that little yawn. 7 habits of highly effective people, and he says most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. Think about that. Most people do not listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. So what are poor listening habits? How would we describe them? Refusing to listen, right? That's where you just shut it off. People are talking and you're not listening at all. Pseudo listening is when you're pretending to listen. You're kind of listening. Your attention is a little bit focused. And it looks like you're listening, but you're really not. Selective listening is when you actually listen to different things, like you'll focus on different parts of the way someone is saying. This especially happens like when there's emotions involved, when you're having an argument. You might focus on words that trigger you or things that you already have in your mind, like things that you're upset about. And so you select certain things to focus on and what they're saying to back up. Yeah, I'm right about that, right? They are a jerk because look at what they're saying to me. So that's what it means by selective listening. So you're not taking the gestalt, which is the whole thing. You're not just hearing them, putting your attention on them, but you're doing this evaluation. You're selecting what you want to listen to and what you don't want to listen to. And then there's this thing called evaluative listening, which is actually your judging, okay? It's when you're placing your judgment, different than selective, when you're actually putting your judgment on what they're saying, how they're saying it. It's kind of, evaluative listening is often like argumentative listening, the same kind of idea, okay? There's when you're evaluating and arguing with what they're saying. You're not saying anything, but in your mind you are. Whenever you do this, whenever you in your mind, you have all this stuff going on in your head while someone's talking to you, you're really not listening to them and you really can't take in what it is they're saying if you're so busy either selecting what you want to hear, focusing on different things, or you're arguing with them, evaluating them, or you're pretending to listen. I mean, the refusal to listen and pseudo listening are often the habits that we know we're doing consciously. The selective and evaluative we might not be so much aware of, okay? But poor listening habits, because we're not getting the whole thing, okay? And we're going to talk about how we get to understand communication through listening and what we can do to understand better. Remember, the goal is shared meaning. It's the goal of all communication. We're after being on the same page. We can't always be on the same page, but we can even be on the same page in disagreement. We can agree to disagree. You've heard that saying before, right? So what I mean is we're after shared meaning. These things keep us away from that. So let's go on. So the listening process, and I'm going to do this according to the textbook. So the first thing we do is we're receptive. We receive the information, the communication. We're receptive to that person. Then we pay attention to what it is. We have to be receptive though too, right? Because if you go back to the poor listening habits, refusing communication, you're not receptive at all. You won't listen at all. But you have to be receptive. Then you have to pay attention. So you have to put your attention, you have to select your attention. You have to put your attention on what that person is saying. Then you go through this processing where is that interpretation, you're evaluating what they're saying, right? When we do that normally, we're interpreting like, what does that mean? Evaluating, are they saying this? What does that mean? Then you create your response. It may take you a while to create your response. You might not have a response. Oftentimes, if it's a highly emotional conversation, you should give yourself some pause before you come back, because chances are, if you let yourself cool down a little, when you respond, you will have a much more functional response that might help the conversation move forward than if you just respond immediately in an emotional way after you've processed the stuff. Okay, you with me? And then we retain it. Again, remember that part about how we put all that information goes into our information and what we know about that person and that relationship. We retain it. right? Becomes part of our memory of that conversation. If we're paying attention. If we're not paying attention, right? Someone can be telling us something. If you're not paying attention, you don't retain it. So let's go through an example of listening process. So I'm sitting here, I'm open. The student says, Ms. Brennan, I need to talk to you about my assignment. The assignment, I need to talk to you about my grade on the assignment. And I say, okay, what do you want to talk about? And they say, well, you gave me a C on the assignment, and I really think that I deserve at least a B, if not a B plus, because I did this. Here's the guidelines of the assignment, and I fulfilled this requirement. I fulfilled this criteria, and I filled this, and I even did this. So I don't understand why I'm having a C. So I say, okay, so you don't understand why you have a C because you fulfilled all these requirements. And what I see is you didn't do, but there's this other requirement you didn't do that, like you didn't spell check it, and you didn't grammar check it. So it wasn't written very well. Yes, did you have all your citations? Yes, you did. Did you attempt to use source citation and style? You did. But there's this other stuff in terms of a college level. It needs to be a little bit more. So that's what happens with that conversation. So that same student comes back to me a month later in class and says, Ms. Brennan, I need to talk to you about this grade I got. You gave me a B and I think I deserve an A. And then they gave all the reasons why. And what happens is I remember the student, let's call the student Toby. Okay, I remember what Toby said to me. And I remember I retained that information. And so I have developed this idea about Toby. Okay, one is Toby cares about her grades. Toby also might be a student that likes to complain a lot. There's all kinds of different opinions. But my opinion about Toby is not going to be limited to this one conversation. But that conversation I had previously goes into how I retain and what kind of relationship and how I feel about Toby. Okay? This is what happens if you're in the listening process on the other side of communication, not just the talking part, but what happens when you're listening, right, in that process. All right, what's next? So listening with your ears. Let's cover this and we'll talk about listening with your eyes. So when we listen with our ears, we pick up the words, obviously, and the way we say the words, the tone of our voice. Are we talking loud? Are we talking really soft? What does it mean? When we really get excited about something, then it means something different than if you just wanted, this is what this is about, right? I'm just going to talk about listening with your ears. Totally different, right? That's what we do when we're listening with our ears. We're listening to tone, volume, clarity. Could we understand the person? Yawning. You saw me yawning, right? It's yawning because it's late in the day and I'm a little tired and I've been on the computer for a while and I'm not yawning anymore. But what does yawning say? Listening ears, you can hear someone when they're yawning, right? In fact, I'm talking about yawning. I want to yawn again. That's the sound of a yawn. We can hear that. Other noises they might make, right? Maybe they sniffle a lot, right? Groans, people groans, right? You've been around your older people in your life, your grandparents or your parents, and they groan about, their hip hurts or this hurts or that hurts. They groan or they groan because like, ugh, right? It could be just like out of frustration. Coughing, someone's coughing tells you something about that. We listen with our ears. The laughter, someone's laughing, we listen for that. The sighing, all of these things communicate something about their relationship and communicate something about how they're feeling, right? And how they feel about what they're saying. Crying, breathing, even breathing. Right? You ever talk to someone and they talk so fast you're like out of breath? That's been me before. If I have too much coffee, that happens. Okay, let's move on to listening with your eyes. And we're going to actually stop here because I'm going to run out of time. And we'll be right back. This will be part 2 of listening for understanding. Awesome-y.